Hi. So I'm really excited to have Phil Lyons here to present tonight. Sweet. Because I've gotten to know him a little bit through emails and so on, and he's passionate about this subject, and I think it'll be interesting to all of you. He's going to focus on two New Hampshire brothers, David and Samuel Hobart, who were really instrumental in helping the Patriot cause. And both, in their own way, had some dealings with John Stark as the Live Free or Die fame and one of our revolutionary people. So David Hobart, who that Bill will talk about first, was one of the town's original settlers, if not the original settler. And for those of you who live out near Fairgrounds Road or on Fairgrounds Road, he has he bought eventually a house that then became the house of Bill and Betty Batchelor, and we have a map, which is also in Stern's History of Plymouth, New Hampshire, which you can buy, or you can just Google it and get the information. But there's a map here for anyone who actually lives on Fairgrounds Road, if I want to see it, of what the original settlement plan was. This was actually what was drawn up by the original founders, the Plymouth. And what else about David? Well, that's pretty much it. So Bill Lyons himself is a descendant of the Hobart family, and he has a long-standing passion for history. And currently he's a judicial referee, but last year he retired as the presiding justice of the Manchester District Court, which he's been since 1996. Before that, he was a prosecutor for the Laconia Police Department and worked for the New Hampshire Attorney General's office in the criminal division. So if you do want to know more about, if you're really Plymouth-centric and you want to know more about David Hobart, I recommend Googling Ezra Stern's History of Plymouth. Look in the index, and you can find out all kinds of interesting facts. Or look up your own ancestors, or whoever lived on the property that you now live in.
Cheap. Well, thank you. That was a very kind introduction. And I want to publicly thank both Marianne and Marcia for their help in getting me to the point where this is organized as well as it is. I'm very pleased to be here with you folks tonight. I'm sure some of you have ancestors that go back to this period of time and participated in the American War for Independence. We all remember the big figures, George Washington, Ben Franklin, and the like. There are a whole number of second and third tier individuals who had leadership roles who tend to be forgotten and written out of the narrative over time. If you look at some of the early historiography of these histories, you'll see some of these people mentioned. In this case, I'm talking about two brothers who I believe did play an important part, not just in the War for Independence, but they had a strange interaction with John Stark that impacted his career. Couple of caveats. My historical records, even though I've spent 15 years looking at this, are incomplete. I don't have journals or diaries that let me get into the minds of these folks to understand why they made some of the decisions that they made. So what I have to do is informed speculation, the sort of thing that I used to do when I was trying criminal cases and explaining to you why it was that I thought the person was guilty. So I'm taking known information and known history and working back from there. The brothers, Sam and David, grew up on a farm in Hollis. Hollis is located here, but they were born down in Groton. The family had lived in Groton for 2 generations. Prior to this, there was only one reason why the families had to stay there. They were the very edge of civilization. Indian raids were brought on by the various wars, had managed to end at Groton. In fact, during the King Philip's War, Groton had to be evacuated because it was so far out on the edge. It was the founding of Fort Number 4 in Charlestown, New Hampshire, that allowed people to move to Hollis. During the French and Indian War, David, born in 1722, would serve in John Gough's regiment, and he, at the conclusion of his service, would be awarded a land grant. A couple of points about that. Early in the French and Indian War, the colonists were not excited about participating with the British Army. The reason was that the British officers tended to look down on them, treat them in a very bad fashion. They also were concerned about their pay. Lord Pitt the Elder went to the position of allowing them to form their own regiments and paying the royal governors in gold, which will have a tremendous impact on the economy when the war ends. It also had the byproduct of making Americans have a belief in their own superiority as a fighting force and feeds into their belief in independence. Sam Cummings was the richest man in Hollis, New Hampshire, and he persuaded David and several other Hobart families, as well as some other folks, to use their land grants to move north to found the town of Plymouth. That is, let's see if I can do this, yes. That is supposed to be the original homestead that was developed in Plymouth. It was David who was supposed to have done that. I've learned that he had a license for liquor, which meant he was a tavern owner. The land is, again, on Justice Batchelor's, what was Justice Batchelor's home, and I wished I'd known that 40 years ago when I was trying cases in front of him. David was one of the original incorporators of the town, and again, that map that you can see was laid out in part by David. From the very beginning of the town, David held about every office there was to hold in the town. Militia was not just a town function. Militias were organized into areas, and the town of Plymouth was an area of 8 or 9 towns, and they all fell under a command of a colonel. So the colonel ended up being this man, John Fenton, who had nothing to do with Hollis. He was a plant that was brought in. You heard mention of the governor's portion of land. What had happened was Mr. Fenton was a retired British officer. He was asked, they asked that he be given some positions of power and sort of treating him like a lord. Well, he was made a judge. He ended up also being made colonel because of his prior military experience. Flash forward as hostilities, or the beginning of hostilities, begins to develop, and he is Plymouth's representative to the New Hampshire legislature, or the New Hampshire Provincial Congress. As things get bad, he makes the decision that he cannot remain on the side of the Patriot. It is David Hobart who goes to Exeter to represent the people of Plymouth in that time right around Lexington and Concord. And he will return to Plymouth, and in Plymouth he will end up assuming the rank of colonel and being responsible for the militia in the area. I told you about the area that the colonel was in charge of. You should see the state papers in this particular time period. All of the towns are beseeching the provincial legislature for supplies, gunpowder, lead, weapons, because they know that it is likely that they will be raided by Indians who have associated themselves with the British government. And there is a tremendous fear. You can see it in all of the letters. So what was David's job? It was to train and organize the militia, not just for his town, but to develop them so that they could do a joint defense in the event that there was a raid on the town. It was his job, along with some of the other town fathers, to draft men in the event that you did not have enough volunteers to serve in the Continental Line regiments. And as circumstances would require, he was to defend the towns within the region. And as you will see towards the end of this presentation, if an invader came, he was to marshal and lead soldiers to repel an invasion. I'm going to leave David for now. We're going to come back to Samuel Hobart. I'm going to call him Sam. There's a big disagreement for those of you who drink Sam Adams beer as to whether or not he would have been appalled if you called him Sam instead of Samuel. I'm calling him Sam. Sam serves multiple tours in John Goff's regiment. He rises to the rank of major. That was a big deal for him. And it was a big deal in a couple of ways, because when he comes home, he becomes Hollis's representative to the New Hampshire legislature. Every document I read in the state papers always refers to him as Major Hobart. His military service apparently was something that was of great importance to him. He also assumes the position of being elected treasurer for the county of Hillsborough and their registrar of deeds. In fact, I found where he put out money to buy a stove for the first jail in Hillsborough County, and I think they're still using it. And he also serves as an attorney for Sam Cummings for some events that are occurring in the midst of the 1760s and into the early 1770s. This is probably the appointment that has the most pivotal impact on Sam's life and Sam's career. He's appointed to be a judge in Hillsborough County, and the supervisory judge is Matthew Thornton. Well, you know that Matthew Thornton's a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Can you wonder about what happened in those conferences that he had in the back room as they discussed what was the proper place of a British citizen living in the colonies vis-a-vis the Parliament and the King? Did this impact the way Major Hobart considered himself and considered his relationship? I can't tell you whether that's correlation or causation. I can only raise that as a question for you. But I think it'll be clear from what happens from here forward that they developed a trusting relationship where Thornton resided a great deal of faith in Sam Hobart, and that will impact what happens with regard to Hobart in the future. This, I think, is the other pivotal event in Sam's life. His wife passes away on May the 20th, 1773. He had 2 children at the time, a daughter who would marry within a year, and a son, and it appears that he put that son in the care of other relatives. Now, he's in the legislature at this point in time, and he is having almost daily contact in these legislative sessions with everyone who signs the Declaration of Independence, with the generals. He's having contact with all of the leadership that would become the patriots in this nation. How could that not have impacted what he was choosing to do? Within the area of Hollis, just like there were 7 or 8 towns in the area of Plymouth, they had the same sort of situation down in Hollis. He was a lieutenant colonel and was promoted to the rank of colonel when the commanding officer, who was also a loyalist, chose to resign. I saw references to him being the commander of the 2nd Minuteman Militia Regiment, and I've got to tell you, I've never been able to find any information about what that was, whether that was simply a new designation for the area of the Hollis militia. I cannot confirm that one way or the other. 1775, April the 19th. We all know what happens. Lexington and Concord. Within 2 days, the New Hampshire legislature meets and creates a committee for a joint defense with Massachusetts. The New Hampshire legislature committed itself to rebellion 2 days after Lexington and Concord. Who's on that committee? Nathaniel Folsom. Nathaniel Folsom was a delegate to the First Continental Congress along with John Sullivan. Josiah Bartlett, probably from West Wing or maybe from reading other things, you know that he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Why Sam Hobart there? The committee is appointed by President of the Congress, Matthew Thornton. Is that causation or simply correlation? They go to Massachusetts. They meet with the authorities in Massachusetts, and they're told, hey, we got a bunch of guys down here from New Hampshire. They're hanging out, and we've already sworn them in as a regiment. Would you like to take them on? And they go, sure. Well, Sam acts as a muster master. What a muster master does is he makes a list of who is in fact in the regiment. He makes them sign their oath, and he creates that service roll so that the adjutant of the regiment can say whether or not they're present for pay purposes later on. When he returns to New Hampshire, along with Folsom and Bartlett, he ends up being tasked to be the muster master for the additional regiments that are being raised. This is a map of Boston and the siege. Let's see if I can do this. This is where Winter Hill is. At the time, Whitey Bulger was not running the place. And it turns out that it ends up as being Stark's headquarters. And that is where we will encamp all of the New Hampshire soldiers. Washington will assume command on July the 3rd. Generally speaking, he's upset with the conditions within the camps. One exception to that was Nathaniel Greene's camp. Nathaniel Greene's camp is right next to the camp that Stark is maintaining. Right in this period of time, late May, there becomes a tremendous command controversy. Under the customs and traditions at the time, if you were the commander of the 1st Regiment, you were senior and the ultimate authority for the military in the field. So if there was a 2nd and a 3rd and a 4th Regiment, you were the one who was in charge. A letter had come out that indicated that a regiment that was presently being raised in Exeter under James Reed might get the title of being the 1st Regiment. And that infuriated Stark. Stark left Boston, made his way to the legislature in Exeter, and he addressed them in a rather acerbic, confrontational means. In fact, he was so upset and he was so demanding that his regiment be marked first that he leaves even before they vote. So they send him a letter, and it's got good news and it's got bad news. Here's the good news. John, you're in charge of the 1st Regiment. Here's the bad news. We're making a brigadier general. Because of some things that'll happen later on, I wonder whether or not Sam Hobart was sitting in the legislature at that point in time. According to the rolls that I've seen, he had been Hollis's representative, and in June he will stop being the representative and basically work full-time for the militia.
Yeah.
But if he had been in the hall, he would have been noticed by Stark because he's the one who swore Stark's regiment in. Could the good news, bad news have been something that concerned Stark and impacted the way he treats Hobart in the future? It's a very busy time in Exeter. Men are coming in as volunteers. Officers are being selected. And Hobart is acting as muster master, again, creating these lists, getting everyone together. And the 2nd Regiment under Colonel James Reed is organized and marches in early June down to Winter Hill. Hobart brings them, makes sure that they get associated there. Then about the middle of June, he goes back because he receives word that the 3rd Regiment under Enoch Poor is ready to be sworn in and to be moved down. Again, Hobart takes that regiment down to Winter Hill, and the legislature decides he's going to be the paymaster for all of the forces serving in the siege lines. It's sort of unclear. I believe, based upon what I'm reading or what I've seen, that he spent the majority of his time down in the siege lines in Boston with the soldiers. However, he's getting assignments from time to time. He was tasked by Thornton to write rules and regulations of war for the soldiers. Now, he could have done that down outside of Boston just as well as anything else. But I believe that he does spend most of his time in the siege lines. Well, long about the time the 3rd Regiment comes down, it's time for Brigadier General Folsom to come down and assume command. He is not well received.
What the fuck is this?
Stark avoids him. Stark has just done a great report on his participation in the Battle of Bunker Hill. Instead of submitting this report to his commanding officer, he sends that report directly to the legislature. Some of you might remember that Horatio Gates did the same thing to George Washington in the wake of the Saratoga campaign. And some of you might remember how George Washington felt about that.
Wait.
So Folsom ends up directly confronting Stark, giving him an order, at which point Stark says, I'm not taking orders from you. I'll take my pack and go home. Folsom writes it up, sends it to the New Hampshire legislature, which does nothing. You know, when a week earlier you've been the hero of the Battle of Bunker Hill, kind of hard to discipline you at that point in time. So they let it go. Interesting way to resolve this. The problem existed while Washington is there from July the 3rd on, but Washington came with a couple of little goodies. And one of the little goodies that he had was a commission for a brigadier general, and that brigadier general was John Sullivan. John Sullivan then is put to be in command of the New Hampshire regiments, and Folsom is convinced to go back to Exeter to coordinate the war effort for the New Hampshire forces from Exeter. Stark doesn't really contest the authority of Sullivan. He sort of like lives with it. But again, who is the representative of the New Hampshire legislature there on the scene? It's Sam Hobart as paymaster. He's the one to whom, if the money's not coming in, you're going to complain. That's a picture of John Sullivan. Interesting guy. His service in the military was largely ceremonial before the war. He was a militia major, not well liked in his community. Seems he sued about everybody in the town for debt. Early on in his career, there's some thought that he enjoyed the social side of being a general officer rather than the command side. But it is something that he grew into. I think sometimes he gets unfairly blamed for things. But he did have some excuses for the things that went against him, like the Battle of Long Island, like Brandywine. But ultimately, he is a fairly good commanding officer. Fall turns to winter. People's enlistments were running out. Most of the New Hampshire soldiers agreed to stay. The New Hampshire legislature realized that they had to pay the soldiers. They voted an amount of money, and they had two colonels, Walker and Sam, who were supposed to inspect the rolls and make payment. As they get down there, it's late December. They're going through the rolls, and Sam recognizes that they made a mistake. The mistake was when they swore in the soldiers from Stark's unit, the Massachusetts authorities paid on the lunar month, not on the calendar month. The lunar month is shorter than the calendar month.
That's it.
We got a problem. We don't have enough money. He writes to the authorities in Exeter, and he asks, would you please vote some more money? And I'm sending Walker up, and please send the money down to us. Well, they approve the money, and it reaches the Winter Hill encampment undisturbed by Whitey Bulger on the 2nd. However, this event will have significant impact on the careers of several people. On December the 30th, 1775, a group of soldiers from Stark's militia regiment go to Hobart's quarters, and they demand their money. And he tells them the truth. I don't have enough money to pay everyone. Not satisfied with the answer, they accost him. They literally drag him to the quarters for Stark. Stark doesn't order him released. Stark speaks ill of the New Hampshire legislature. There had been some things that he'd asked for in terms of supplies and things that hadn't been ordered during the summer. Whether or not he held it against them for what happened with regard to the promotion of Folsom to general. But he speaks ill of him. And thereafter, the men take Hobart out, and they sort of frog march him to a tune called the Rogues' March out of the camp in Winter Hill. When he gets back to his quarters, he finds that 250 pounds sterling is missing. Doesn't sound like a lot of money, right? I ran a computer simulation as to what it would be. It's about $62,000. This is the original letter that Hobart writes. When I first started looking at documents, and if you go to the state papers, it tells you this doesn't exist. I actually found it in the Meacham Ware papers, Meacham Ware being a native of Plymouth. And it lays out the entire problem that occurred. Well, 2 days later, this is a letter from the New Hampshire Provincial Congress that is sent to George Washington with a copy to General Sullivan. Gee, who's the author? Matthew Thornton. Is this simply causation, or are we looking at coincidence?
Yeah.
And they want expeditious action. And one might wonder, why did they speak directly to General Sullivan? Could it be that they expected that he should have treated or seen that a field grade officer in New Hampshire was treated better? Sullivan, note the date. This is 2 weeks after the letter that they author. And what does he say? Oh, gee, I didn't know about it. And by the time I found out, Stark had gone off recruiting. I don't understand why there's a delay in answer. It doesn't make any sense. The excuse that how could he allow Stark to go recruiting when they're thinking about having an attack on Boston doesn't make any sense. Not only that, if you read any of the biographies of Stark, Molly Stark was pregnant at the time, living in Dunbarton.
Yeah.
Where do you go to recruit? I certainly wouldn't go to a borough in New York to try and raise people to come work for me or do something with me. I'd go to where I live, where people knew me. Do you really think that John Stark would have gone to the area in which he lived, Dunbarton, New Hampshire, and not have visited and checked on his wife? If you read the biographies, he doesn't see his wife and his newborn child until early May of 1776, as his unit is making its way up to Lake Champlain. And I guess another thing that doesn't make this make any sense to me is if a colonel was frog marched out of a camp to the tune of the Rogues March, don't you think that about anybody above the rank of PFC would have heard about it? My belief is that that was well known within the camp, but Stark's unavailable. Why? Because I believe that Sullivan and perhaps other high-ranking officers were hoping to keep him as an irritant away from Hobart, and that they then lobbied Hobart to withdraw the charges. Think about what's happening right at that moment. The attack on New Year's Eve on Quebec had failed. The commanding officer, Montgomery, is dead. Benedict Arnoldsley is wounded. There's no hope of taking Quebec. That news just arrived. Yet we have a standoff in Boston. You've got in Stark a man who has fought 2 battles so far in this war for independence and has proven himself to be a good combat commander. There was an effort to save him, and they had to make him disappear so that they could try and reduce the irritation that Colonel Hobart was feeling. Nathaniel Greene, who next to Washington is probably the best general that we had during the American Revolution, would be the presiding officer in the court of inquiry. It sort of makes sense. in a number of ways because he was in the adjoining division. But he also was a favorite of George Washington's. When this information gets back to Thornton, they're not impressed. They set up a committee to look into this affair. Before that committee can meet, the results come in from Greene's inquiry. And what do they say? That John Stark's conduct was wrong, that Hobart's complaints were well-founded. However, Hobart accepted an apology, and they saw no reason to go to a court-martial. They send this off to the authorities in Exeter, and they end up forming another committee because they're unsatisfied. Stark's apology is, Marcia called it pathetic, I think. It's wonderful. It's blame the victim. Sam Hobart didn't pay my guys. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't realize. I was so tied up in paperwork. I think he spells Hobart's name 3 different ways in the course of this apology. Pardon me. But he does agree that he used harsh and unbecoming language in his diatribe that he engages in that day. Before that committee can meet, the British decide to leave Boston. As we all know, they leave on March the 17th, which the Irish celebrate to this day. When the siege of Boston ends, there's no reason for Hobart to remain there in Boston, and he returns to Exeter. What he finds out is that they're looking to form a gunpowder mill. In America, there was only one gunpowder mill in New Jersey at the outbreak of the war. All the gunpowder that the colonies got came from England. So they go to establish this mill. They were looking for a suitable person to run it. They find that Sam Hobart is a suitable person. He borrows 300 pounds from Sam Folsom. Sam Folsom is General General Folsom's brother. That's also the house that's the American Independence Museum, is Sam's house. And in the contract that they sign, they give Hobart 7 tons of sulfur and 7 tons of saltpeter. With the help of the people and the Exeter Historical Society, they took me out and pardon me, and they showed me a trail where they've got signs up talking about where that mill was located. The picture on the right shows the sluiceway. They dammed the river, they built a sluiceway, they built a water wheel. They used the water power to pulverize the sulfur, the charcoal, and the saltpeter, and then with it pulverized, they mixed it in the appropriate portions to make gunpowder. The gunpowder from that mill would be used to service all of New Hampshire's forces during the American War for Independence. Thereafter, Sam becomes the area colonel for Exeter. He becomes the area colonel because the present colonel, David Gilman, made the decision to become a colonel of one of the line regiments in the Continental Line. He also is elected to be a representative to the New Hampshire State Constitutional Convention, which, again, I wished I had known when I was arguing in front of Justice Batchelor in the Supreme Court. Might have given more credence to some of the arguments I was making. And at the conclusion of the war, Hobart converts the mill into making nails. Not just to close out Sam's contribution, but in some of the very early biographies of Stark, Stark tries to blame Hobart for this whole situation up in the siege lines on December the 30th. And if there was any wrongdoing on the part of Hobart, why would they have found him suitable to run an important defense industry? Why would they have entrusted him with command of the troops in the capital of the revolution? Why would he have had all of these jobs? John Stark is commissioned as a continental colonel. What that means is that the committee that Thornton had set up is no longer operative because they're no longer the employer. The employer is the Continental Congress. Towards the fall, Sullivan is promoted to Major General. The way promotions or the way general officers were divvied up is each state had a certain number. It was an equal number. So if a vacancy occurred and it was a New Hampshire officer, it had to be someone from New Hampshire that would replace him. Well, that fall, the Continental Congress meets, and they appoint James Reed, who had commanded that 2nd New Hampshire Regiment, who had fought at Bunker Hill, to take the position of Brigadier General. Who do you suppose was the only delegate from New Hampshire who was present in Philadelphia when this appointment was made? Matthew Thornton.
She painted the author.
Now, Stark is upset, and he writes a letter about his leadership qualities. He ends the campaign after the Battle of Valcour Island, and we all know those desperate 10 days at the end of 1776. And Stark does join Washington and fights in the Battle of Trenton and Princeton. And there's a remarkable description of Stark's fighting prowess. Talks about him dealing death on the streets of Trenton. All right, now remember, when we go back to the December problem from 1775, his men had agreed to sign on for a year. They also agreed to stay for a few more days so they could fight the Battle of Trenton. But now their time is up. They want to go home. Stark marches with his men and goes back to New Hampshire and begins to enlist a new regiment. In early February of 1777, the Continental Congress promotes a new list of brigadier generals. And that's because James Reed, in his participation in the invasion of Canada, contracted smallpox. He was now blind and very ill. There's no information. I could find absolutely nothing on how they promote people. His is the first name on the list. Does anybody want to guess who is the only delegate from New Hampshire present in Philadelphia when these promotions are made? To say Stark was not amused is probably an understatement. He actually travels from Dunbarton to Exeter and turns in his Continental Commission and says he's going back to his farm and he's going to take care of his mill that he has there on the Piscataqua River, as Piscataquag River. But we all know what happens from there, right? Johnny Burgoyne comes down with a force across Lake Champlain. On July the 4th, he seizes Fort Ticonderoga. The Patriot forces are fleeing. And on July the 7th, there's a battle in a town in Vermont called Hubbardton. In that battle, there's a New Hampshire regiment that is very much demolished, and the Green Mountain Boys fight a great defensive battle, but they're decimated. At the end of the battle, actually, the regiment has sort of fled off, and the authorities in Vermont are terrified that this British force is going to be running across their state, and there is no one to stop them. So what do? They contact New Hampshire and say, "You're our only hope, guys. Will you please send forces to us?" By the 11th of July, they meet to raise two forces, and they ask Stark if he will take a commission as a general, and he agrees, so long as he's a general in New Hampshire only and not responsible to the Continental forces. Then the legislature sends out orders to the colonels in the areas and say, "You will raise regiments for us." And they put David Hobart in charge of one of the regiments, and he has to now draw men from this area and several of the surrounding military areas. Just imagine what that must be like. You had in this area between 800 and 900 men above the age of 16. Who do you take? Who do you leave behind? What is the threat that there will be an Indian raid, and how do you know that your people will be safe? Beyond that, their term of service was for 60 days. So the agreement was, you do this, you fight a battle and turn back the enemy, and we're going to let you come home, and you're going to be able to take in the harvest and prepare for the coming winter. Everybody meets down at Fort number 4. Stark at that point sends a couple of units to be a screening force along the Connecticut River to try and stop any Indian advance or the like, but he takes Hobart with him. And I've been asked, is there a connection at that point that Stark makes? I don't know for sure, but in one of the histories, a man named Potter writes a history of New Hampshire's military. He drops a footnote next to the name of David Hobart and says, "We don't know if he's related to Sam." So if the historians don't know, I'm not quite sure whether Stark knew or not. Okay.
Good.
We know that there's a battle at Bennington. The Battle of Bennington is not fought against the British, largely. It's fought against Germans. There were German dragoons, and that would be the way they were attired. Dragoons are soldiers who make their way to battle on horses, but fight on foot. The horses didn't make it so well across the Atlantic Ocean. So one of the reasons that they were sent out was to get horses from the communities in Vermont. One of the reasons they're headed towards Bennington is because Bennington had a supply of livestock that had been gathered to support the Vermont forces, and as the Germans were moving along, the citizens were fleeing in their face. A few people did rally to the cause of the Burgoyne's troops, but most people were taking their livestock and moving down to what they thought would be the shelter of Bennington. At the same time, Stark meets with Seth Warner, who heads the Green Mountain Boys. I believe in Manchester, Vermont. Started in Peru and moved his way over. And Warner says, look, I'll leave somebody in charge to refurbish my regiment, and I'll go with you down to Bennington. On the 14th of August, there's sort of a chance encounter. It occurs in New York. It's called the Wallasumic River. Both sides are sort of shadowboxing each other. Baum knows that this force is big. Originally, he had thought there were 400 men, and that was the contingent that the Vermonters had. But Stark has 1,500. Baum's only got 750. He knows that engaging in battle at that point would be dangerous, so he falls back and begins to entrench. The following day, there is an all-day rain, and from reading the accounts, it sounds to me like it was a tropical depression. You know, that sort of thing that like wipes out the roads and most life forms. But what it does is it allows Stark two really important advantages. First, the natives that had accompanied Baum had decided to leave. That deprived him of scouts as well as soldiers. Beyond that, Stark had engaged in a series of scouting ventures, and as a consequence of that, he knew exactly where Baum's troops were. Now, Baum does ask for reinforcements. He asked for that on the 14th. They haven't shown up, and on the 16th, we end up with what will be a double envelopment, the Battle of Bennington. On the right, that's what a redoubt would look like. That's the German redoubt. That's the way it appears at Bennington. Great place to visit if you want to see the battlefield. This is a recreation, and I understand that is on the precise spot that the German redoubt was built. One of the really bizarre parts of this, and you look at that map, and excuse me, and you see this distance, and you don't get a sense of it until you go there. Those fortifications couldn't mutually support one another. There also was an area behind the German redoubt where there was a baggage train, and they tried to fortify that. So what Stark does is he has the Vermont troops begin to attack from the rear. He sends another group of troops, Vermont troops, to attack on this side of the redoubt. He is going to lead some of his force up to attack the redoubt, but he assigns Hobart and Stickney. Stickney is the colonel who had the regiments down near Hanover in Lebanon and raised the men from there to take out the Loyalist redoubt. If you go to that spot, it's sort of like Bunker Hill on a flat plain. Did he know that Hobart was a relationship? The only thing is that there are only between 70 and 80 Loyalists, as well as a few German soldiers in that redoubt. When Hobart and Stickney come up, it is a serious gunfight. To Stark's credit, in his after-action report, he said that that Hobart's men fought like tigers. It wasn't going well for them. This was hand-to-hand. This was nobody was giving way, and ultimately, what ends up happening is a Massachusetts regiment comes up from the rear, and that panics the Loyalists, who begin to run. See that? And at the same time, Baum realizes his position is untenable. He orders his men to draw their swords and cut their way through the soldiers that are attacking him. Both forces end up meeting on the banks of the Wallasumic River, and there is a fight that goes on until Baum is so wounded that they realize it's simply futile to continue. There's a surrender that's occurring at that moment. Think of the chaos. Except there's one real problem. Remember, he asked for reinforcements?
That.
At about 4 p.m, a colonel named Bremen is marching down the road when, in dribs and drabs, people are running towards him, saying there's a great battle going on. He claims not to have heard it. Suddenly, small groups of militiamen who had been chasing those who had escaped began to come across this force that's now deployed and moving forward. There's a gunfight going on. Again, think of no unit is in the right position at this point in time. Some people are guarding prisoners. Some folks are attending to the wounded. People are dead. Some people are looting the camps. There's a fight that occurs, and the Patriots are giving ground. But at that decisive moment, Seth Warner's Green Mountain Boys come in. They conduct a flank attack that so disrupts the German line that they flee and retreat. That ends the battle. That mission, 1,500 men lost in the battle, led to Burgoyne's army being reduced by 10%. His supply shortage continued and became even more acute with every day that passed. What had happened is, to slow his progress towards Albany, there were a group of colonists who were cutting down trees and blocking every road, damming up water, making it impossible for him to make more than a mile advance a day. And he's running out of food because his line is all the way back to Quebec and Montreal. It was a brutal battle for Plymouth. David Hobart's nephew, Solomon, dies in the encounter. After they have spent the day collecting up prisoners, sorting out weapons, Stark marches with his brigade, minus a detachment that goes to take the prisoners off to Boston, and they march to Stillwater, New Hampshire, which is the main camp where the forces are trying to repel Burgoyne that will ultimately end with Saratoga. They remain there until their 60-day commitment is up. The men refuse to stay. There was a battle 2 days later, the Battle of Freeman's Farm, but they aren't there for the battle. But as they're headed home, and Stark, having no command, is headed home with them, William Whipple, another signer of the Declaration of Independence, is coming with that second force that was raised. As that second force, and Stark decides he's going to join with them. That force then plays a decisive role in the outcome of the battle, because after Freeman's Farm, there's a battle called Bemis Heights, and Burgoyne thinks he's got to retreat, except that Stark takes the New Hampshire troops and occupies a hill called now Stark's Knoll, blocking his retreat, giving him no choice but to surrender. David Hobart returns to Plymouth. His wife would die the following year. And goodness, if anybody can tell me the answer to this, I would love to know it. He marries a woman from Haverhill, Massachusetts. And then he decides to resign his commission and move to Haverhill, Mass. I have no idea how a man living in Plymouth in the Revolutionary War area ends up having a relationship with someone in Haverhill, Massachusetts. But that sort of is the way it goes with David. I have some of you folks were nice enough to help me try and locate the grave markers in Haverhill. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find them, but I do want to try and make their way down there as soon as I get a gun permit.
That's such an.
I think that from what you can see in this, that New Hampshire, like Massachusetts, was opposed to British rule in a significant way and ready for armed resistance in 1775. I think there are a lot of reasons for that. One of the things that we will never know the answer to is, we've all heard the quote by John Adams about how 1/3 of the people were in favor of the revolution, 1/3 of the people were against it, and there was a third in the middle that didn't know what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
I don't think that applied in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And one of the reasons we can't really know the answer is because New Hampshire never suffered the crucible of having battles fought and having its territory occupied. People did not have to make the tough choice. Their only leadership was Patriot. So we have an extraordinarily low number of people who made the decision to side with the British. I think there's a tremendous story about what our population did here. And for those of you who have relatives, you want to think about a 15-year sojourn into looking up what they did. Because there's more to what happened in this state than the signers of the Declaration of Independence, than those generals like Stark and Enoch Poor. There are these individual stories that will give you some level of context as to what's going on. And while the lack of primary sources does make their contribution somewhat difficult to identify, I hope you will come away from this believing that David and Sam did their part to make the state of New Hampshire a free place. Thank you very much. Any?
Thank you, Bill. Schraden. Are you willing to take a few questions?
Sure.
Would anybody like to?
Yes, ma'am.
Like, so that Gensers went to Exeter and asked the legislature for money, and they gave it to him? Sure. Give money to anybody. Didn't he have a letter? What?
Well, I can tell you if you read volume, it's either volume 7 or volume 8, and you go through the correspondence, they seem to be persuaded that they owed it, and it was a debt that they owed, and that they were willing to pay off, even though, I mean, it was a misunderstanding. They didn't realize that they were swearing them in under the lunar month, and they did pay them. I mean, some of those men were choosing to go home. They had done their year, and there's no shame in having served your term and going home. Yes, ma'am.
I think you did a spectacular job of bringing out, what happens to individuals in the course of this war. I also really liked the fact that you talked about the 1-year service and the 60-day service, letting us know that they weren't there the whole time, all of them, but some of them were there, and then they were gone, and then they were there again, and then they come back. I mean, Stark's such a good example of that, as he ping-pongs back and forth. But I, too, find the money situation so interesting. Two things I'm wondering. Okay, so we're back to the bar. What happened to the $250 that was stolen from him?
I haven't been able to find an answer to that. There are... Edward Everett writes a biography of Stark. He quotes a major named Dixon that I've never been able to find anything about, and they imply that Hobart stole it. And that's why I wanted to bring out all this other stuff that he does, because If that was believable, then why are you entrusting him with these defense industries? That was what I thought was just didn't make that story go together. In fact, in the memoir that he gives to Caleb, he says, well, I don't want to say anything about Sam Hobart. I mean, he might have family that's still alive. 200 years later, 250 years later, well, I guess we're still alive. But again, if you noticed in what he wrote, he tries to shift all the blame and make himself blameless. But the blame is that Hobart is a bad guy. But that doesn't hold up if he's immediately contacting and sending someone to get the money to pay the people. It just does not go with him being a bad public servant.
And then I had one other that dealt with never would have been paid on a lunar versus a regular calendar month. What's up with Massachusetts doing that?
I think it goes back to some of their earlier wars, but that's the way they did it. And again, when they entered continental service, there was an issue that arose with regard to that too. Yes, ma'am.
These guys were farmers. What did they know from calendars?
Yeah, that's probably a good point. And that's among the interesting things. My direct ancestor was a Puritan minister who founded Hingham. And he had 18 children, of which 13 lived to adulthood. There are Hobarts all over the American Revolution. I haven't found a single Hobart who became a loyalist. 18 of them are involved in the Dorchester occupation with the cannons on March the 5th, 1776. 2 Hobarts die at Bunker Hill. All of the Hobarts in that Townsend-Groton area are involved in militia activities, including watching the prisoners from Bennington as they are brought across. Not a single Hobart becomes a loyalist. I think part of that has to do with religion, that Puritans become Congregationalists. The Congregationalists were appalled at the notion that the Anglicans were going to send a bishop to New Hampshire or to North America, that they saw that problem. I mean, that's what, in part, what our English Revolution was all about. All of these things play in a very unusual way. For example, Hollis. Right after the battles of Lexington and Concord, they raise a militia company. It doesn't join New Hampshire. It goes to Groton, Massachusetts, and joins with William Prescott, and that New Hampshire company is in the redoubt at Bunker Hill. And there are 2 Hobart cousins, one in Groton, one of them in Hollis. They're in that fortification, and both are killed in the Battle of Bunker Hill. I don't. There is something that was very strong in the feelings of the people of New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and it's hard. But again, what we don't have is occupation. What we don't have is to make that tough choice. The tough choice that Frenchmen had to make during World War II as to whether to cooperate with the Germans. The tough choice that people living in the Netherlands had to make in World War II. Until you face that crucible, we can't know whether or not how deep, whether it was they were a mile wide and an inch deep, or whether they were very heavily committed to the revolution. In that way, for those of us who have relatives who are, or ancestors who came in this area. Goodness gracious, we can have a certain degree of pride that we didn't remain loyal to the crown. But goodness gracious, how do we know what we would have done, what our ancestors would have done when faced with that tough choice?
One more question?
I'll tell you, I was warning of the judge in Dallas for tuning late.
Hobart. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And thank you all for coming. We hope to see you again. A reminder, May 18th is our the grand opening of our new exhibit for the summer and the beginning of the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Historical Society. There are some refreshments in the back. You're welcome to stay and chat for a bit. And I hope you'll come back. So thank you for being here.
If anybody wants a map of the original lots of limits, come see me. And
Bag of this month.
get some questions.
Yes, ma'am.